Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and so today I thought I would kind of chime in on this whole thing about the coronavirus. I'm not a virologist or a scientist or anything like that, but I've lived in China over 10 years, and so I figured, I'd at least put in some of my observations or ideas I've had about the whole coronavirus thing. So I've lived in China over 10 years, and I just left recently, only about 2-3 months ago, in June of 2022. And so when the whole thing broke out, around, I guess most of the world knew around January 2020, and I was living in Chengdu at that time. And to be honest with you, I just assumed it was, just a regular virus from like an animal, right? And so I didn't think too much of it, and I think most people in the world didn't at that time. And for, I would say, at least a year and a half, I just assumed that was the main thing. I thought the lab theory was kind of silly, maybe it was like a conspiracy that's like, oh, not really, but some ideas have changed over time about that, and I'll mention why. The Chinese markets I've been to are like 90% pork. There's only 1 or 2 tables that have beef, and there's a little bit of chicken, but it's almost all pork. Which makes some sense because, it's not like they have huge grazing areas where they could have a bunch of like livestock and things around. So, like dairy products and beef products are actually a relatively new thing to China, and I think to a degree in East Asia, maybe not Japan. And so they do have the seafood area too, which has, like regular seafoods, and they do have some weird things. There's some snakes and other kind of weird stuff. But my point is that I don't really see too many unusual things at the market. So almost all of the market is going to be pork, pretty much. I think I saw a statistic that said half of the pigs in the world are in China. That wouldn't surprise me. And so I've never really seen that I could remember. Now, I first lived there 16 years ago. I mean, maybe there was some weird animals occasionally went into markets. I don't remember anything that stood out. I don't have any photos or anything like that, which kind of brings me to maybe the first point. If this was one of the biggest markets in China, or at least in that city, Wuhan, I'm surprised I haven't seen anything on social media, people just filming markets, because that's kind of a popular thing for a lot of YouTubers to do, to an extent, whether they're Chinese or, like foreigners or whatever. And so I kind of looked around and I didn't see really anything from YouTube or anything like that. And it's not like, the Chinese government can obviously restrict any of the media in their own country. But I was surprised, like, no foreigners or no people had anything about this Wuhan market. And I did search on the Chinese sites and I couldn't find anything. When I typed in the Chinese characters like, Wuhan's seafood market, which, not a surprise. Even if there was, they probably would block it. So that was my first idea. I'm like, that's kind of weird. I can't actually see anything. Now, did they sell some weird animals there? Sure, it's possible. But that was kind of unusual. So another point about this is you will see on YouTube a lot of videos that do say it's the Wuhan market. And it's not, because I've seen these videos and they're like in Indonesia or somewhere else. And it's very obvious to me because although China's undeveloped in some ways, some of these areas are like definitely, you can see by the license plate and everything, it's Indonesia. And so you'll also see a few Chinese people that are like eating bats and things like that. And that's true, that could be happening. But that's also not in China, as far as I know. They were on trips in other countries. I don't like to call out Indonesia. I'm actually not sure where they are, but it's not China. So this idea that this is like a popular thing in China, or that these videos that are online are from Wuhan, as far as I know, I have not seen anything pre-pandemic, So another point is they cleaned out this whole area, and if there was, the coronavirus from an animal, they would have found it, because when the original big SARS thing happened in 2003, it was like 7 or 8 years later, they actually identified where it came from in nature somewhere, like in Yunnan or wherever they found it. And so I was surprised. It's like, well, if it did come from the market, how come they never found the animal? Because they completely cleaned out everything, right? So another thing to think about is like, how big is this lab, right? And this lab is definitely not small. As far as I know, it was the biggest at that time, right? And so I think there's a lab in the United States that's going to be bigger, that's almost complete, but it's not a small lab. Like a lot of things in China these days, they build the biggest things, because they have the, the construction and the people who could, make these enormous buildings and things like that in a short time. Which is also a problem because a lot of times they build up a lot of huge things and they don't always have the regulations and stuff like that. And in this case, I guess an easy analogy I could make would be like, is it more likely for an accident to happen in something small or large, right? Like you have a restaurant and they only get 50 customers a day. So how many broken glasses would you have? Well, you might have only 1 or 2 a week. But what if you had a huge banquet hall of like 1,000 people a day? You're going to have a bunch of broken glasses every day, right? And so I assume that a lot of these labs are pretty safe, but actually, like, there's a lot of mistakes. You could look down at like biohazard or like lab leaks in the past. You could look on Wikipedia, and there's lists for decades where this stuff has happened. I mean, there was one in Taipei where someone stabbed themselves with a needle of the SARS virus from like 2003, and all these different things from whether, America or Russia, all over the world. So the idea that these labs are safe is definitely not the case. So another thing to realize is that if they were doing the gain of function research, which is apparently what they were doing, their facility was only like able to handle like the lowest level of viruses. So like a gain of function, I think is like level 3 or 4 out of 5, and they were only like a level 1 or 2. So that's another big problem, that they did not have the safety measures intact. Another thing to think about is, you can look at the congressional report from the United States. Who knows? Maybe it's biased, but I'm sure there's some truth in there. In the summer of 2019, apparently, like there was a lot of reconstruction into like the air conditioning, maybe the like water treatment, and a bunch of things. So that would mean there was a lot of reconstruction going on in this building. And so, I mean, was everything in a safe area? Like maybe some people were working on things and like they maybe safely threw it away in certain areas, and then it was out back somewhere. And these are like where a bunch of construction workers are like hanging out and smoking and throwing. I mean, so it seems like if there's a lot of people doing construction, like I wonder how safe it was. Around that time, either in the summer or that fall, there was like a report of a lot of people getting sick and a lot of people going to the hospital at that time. So I think there was a lot of things happening, not that winter, but maybe even the spring or summer before everyone knew about it. And also these gain of function labs, I mean, there's only, I think like a dozen in the world or something like that does gain of function. And so as I think about a lot of these things, I mean, it's like, for instance, every day people are around like poultry and all these things, like animals that we're eating. So to me, it would seem like there would be much more of an error where like one of these animals would have made us sick, which has been the case in the past. You've got like, bird flu or some flu from like pigs or cattle and these kinds of things. So like to me, the chance of it actually coming, from a bat or someone who had an animal that had contact with the bat would be small. And so, like, I look at some of the other things, just a probability, right? I mean, how were they even getting these bats? I mean, that to me even seems somewhat dangerous. I mean, I assume they had nets, and when they came out, they got them, and then they closed that. I mean, it seems like you could get bit doing something like that. And then bringing them all the way up to Wuhan, which is pretty far. I mean, that's got to be 1,500 or 2,000 miles to bring those all the way back to Wuhan. So right there could be some errors bringing them back. If these bats all originated in Yunnan province, which is southwest China, why didn't it blow up in one of the markets or places there? You know what I mean? I mean, if there's these bats that are like around animals, why wouldn't that like infect that area? Why would it happen so far away? And then you also think it's like, I mean, bats don't even come in contact with animals that much anyway, at least in the wild. I mean, it's like, I'm sure any of us have been in area near caves or areas. Bats are flying around like crazy, eating insects and things like that. It's not like they're going out and like biting animals all the time. Now, if they were in cages with other animals, that might be the case. But like, I don't think that they're eating these bats in China, to be honest. I mean, I think they do a lot of unusual things, but I don't think that that's probably happening. It's not that it's perfect there. I have driven by a truck when I was down near Yulin, Guangxi, where they have this Yulin Dog Festival, and I actually made a short of it on YouTube, and a few thousand people have seen it. And they were transporting a bunch of dogs, and probably for this festival or whatever. So I'm not saying that there's no unusual animals in China they eat, but it's definitely not like a really popular thing. Like, you don't see dog restaurants or many strange things. The strangest things they really eat are just the intestines of animals, but there's really not a lot of unusual things. It's like rabbits, like I said, pork, chicken, beef. To think that this market in 2019 still had a lot of unusual animals is kind of strange also, because the leader of the country, Xi Jinping, is super strict. One of the reasons why I left China, and a lot of things have changed the last 10 years, is because he's very strict, And it used to be in China, everything was kind of laissez-faire. People did kind of whatever. You didn't need a license to drive a motorcycle. You could do whatever. Everything's changed enormously with regulations. I have videos where I just explain how it could take me days just to find a hotel because there's so many regulations. So to think that, a huge market in a big city like Wuhan before like the military games, where all these countries are coming, and those people will probably visit a big market, and they would allow them to sell like koala bears and all these strange animals. Like, it doesn't seem realistic at all. Because I saw on the Wikipedia, it said they sold koala bears and all these kinds of things. And I'm like, if they had all of these weird animals, like, people would definitely have videos of that stuff. I mean, I remember years ago, like in Cambodia or different places, like, and even other places in China, like if they sold insects or weird things, or even snakes and stuff, like, people get out cameras and it's on there. So if this Wuhan seafood market, which was like the size of like a couple football fields, had weird animals, like, we would have seen it, I think, in my opinion. And then, of course, the other story is that it came from like an American lab and, from Fort Detrick. And I talked about this also in another video. That doesn't seem very realistic. I mean, if it had gone out of that lab, I mean, everyone around DC in America would have been infected like months before China. You know what I mean? So it doesn't seem, or there's a story that like the people who were going to the military games from the United States, like the soldiers, infected Wuhan. That also doesn't make sense because, like, China could close its borders and its cities. America doesn't even have closed borders. So how would we make a world virus go around and protect America? It's almost like, like dropping a nuclear bomb on the border of like Mexico and hoping all the nuclear waste doesn't get to you. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to make a bioweapon that, affects the person the most who's trying to spread it, right? So even the question of gain of function, like I said, we're exposed to wild animals all the time, like poultry, pigs, and all this kind of stuff, and other animals that we eat. And so people do get sick all the time. You can see it in the news all the time, like the bubonic plague came out. And it's kind of like you read it and you're like, holy shit. Like, why doesn't it spread across the world? And some of them do, like, like with the flus and different things. But a lot of them aren't that contagious, because we're already been used to being around animals, and there's not like a gain of function added to that virus or whatever. And so you've got like, the first SARS virus, which only affected like maybe a few thousand and only a few hundred died. And this is like millions of people affected and died. And it's like, it's weird because we're around all these animals, nothing happens, but it happened to happen in the one city in the world that's mainly studying the coronavirus. And even if they studied this virus in other places, how were they able to get access to the original source? Because the original source is apparently in China for the most part. I mean, I've heard they have strains in Cambodia and Laos and Southeast Asia, but it seems like the main source of this virus was in Yunnan, which is why they were going there. Because after the first SARS, the scientists started going down and studying the caves in Yunnan. So sure, it could have been an animal. It doesn't really matter now, right? But like, for them to get off from this and blame the world, or like me when I was in China, like, foreigners, it's your virus, is definitely a crime in my opinion. And it's not only the fact that it leaked from their lab, like, I think that could have happened in any country. But the problem is that there's no freedom of speech in China. So this is a problem for the world too, because, there was the one scientist in January or February who tried to speak out, and he was silenced and eventually died from the virus. And that was a huge international news. How many scientists worked at that lab that knew about things 4, 5, 6 months before? I bet you a bunch of people knew about it, and they were afraid to say anything. So this is one of the reasons why, like, I think, like, for many reasons, and I'll have to make another video about this, but, like, I think China's definitely a big threat to the world. I mean, it's, you know, there's no transparency. We don't know what's going on. Right around the time of Chinese New Year, which is, like, I guess, what, the end of January that year, millions of Chinese went abroad. The people there for sure knew that it was a very deadly virus. And they didn't tell anyone, and the people in Italy and Spain and America and everyone, like, they had to feel guilty or racist if they didn't take all these Chinese people, like this one video I showed of this Italian guy of Chinese descent who showed, you know, oh, hug me, you know, I'm not a virus, and everyone took in all the Chinese, and it fucking ruined the economy in people's lives, not only for 2 years, but it's like, I'm in Colorado now, and I mean, inflation is not 8%, it's like 100% in many aspects. You know, the gas is at least twice as much as a few years ago. You know, I'm trying to get a car that's going to take a few more weeks. I mean, it's going to be years. Like, this is like probably 10 years of people's lives ruined, if not everything ruined. I mean, if you had a, you know, like me, I had a tourism business, or you had a hotel, or anything, a restaurant, whatever, you put all your life savings into it, or your time, and you lost everything. You know, even the company tried to rip me off. You know, I had to put down almost $15,000 in case my insurance didn't cover an injury because I was doing tours. And I gave them that money like 6 months after the pandemic began. I was like, there's no financial issues, right? And it's like, oh, no, not at all. And then, of course, when I asked for the money later, they're, oh, well, we're out of business, or I don't have the money now. And so it's been an excuse for people to do not only bad things, but, yeah, just ruin so many people's lives. Now, of course, it was like, you know, 1 or 2 foreign guys who worked at that lab. What is it, Peter Daszak and another guy. And, you know, like, you can't have those guys do the investigation, and they're like friends with everyone at the lab, and they also got paid by the funding that came to that lab. So this guy's filling out an application for like federal funding from probably governments around the world. He gets approved from the United States government to get a bunch of money. Well, I mean, part of his salary's in there. You think he wants to have, you know, on his resume, on his record, that he was possibly, you know, guilty, right? So of course he's not going to like make the people at that lab look guilty, because it makes him look guilty, and it's going to ruin his reputation. So having anyone affiliated with that lab is a total joke, and no one from the WHO was able to go there for like, what, a year later, so they were able to clean up everything. It's a complete joke. And so, yeah, anyone who goes there that says, and you can see all of his footage too, because he says right before the pandemic that this kind of thing could definitely happen, and then after the pandemic he's like, oh, it was an animal for sure. So he completely changed his opinion on that. And so, yeah, that dude's whole story is a fucking bunch of bullshit. And, you know, I mean, it would be different if they had, like, a lot of foreign people working there and you could get more info, but one guy or two, that's not credible at all. They were working with some French scientists for a bit, but I guess they all got kicked out years ago, which is another thing to understand too, is that even if this Peter Daszak guy worked with the Chinese on something like that, that doesn't mean that like he was really on the inside of the inside, like in that lab doing a lot of things. He might have gone out with the field with them. He might have gone out with some drinks with them. It does not mean like it was the head of operations or something like that. So, you know, I mean, like, what most people have been in China a long time, like, they would let you be like in the middle or lower level with something sensitive. They wouldn't let you anywhere near the top. So there's no way this guy was like anywhere in a sensitive area in that building, in my opinion. So yeah, there's no doubt like people should be very weary of China. And this is, I think, just the beginning of a lot of negative things that can happen in the world when you have the largest country in the world and going to be probably the most economically strong and possibly military down the road take over, and we have no idea what's going on. Is the United States perfect? Of course not. But at least here, there's a lot of information that's open. Not everything. But it's definitely a scary thing to think that China's going to be ruling the world, and we've already had this huge catastrophe which has ruined so many lives, and it's something to think about. So anyway, those are just some of my personal opinions. You know, this isn't necessarily science-based. You can look into all the scientific stuff and pick whatever you want, but that's just my take. And I probably won't do too much on China anymore because, you know, obviously I left. I was there a long time, and it was a huge disappointment. You know, not only the virus, them stealing a bunch of money from me, and I'm still going through that lawsuit, but they're not going to get anything, you know, for it. It's just a complete shame. But I guess that's what you get when you deal with a capitalist slash communist slash Confucianist society. I don't even know what it is, but it's doubtful that it was, it was an animal in my opinion, but nothing was ever going to happen regardless, right? So guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content. My channel has a lot of different stuff from my travels around the world, whether hiking or biking, and some of the things over the years I've done, whether I was in the military, commercial fishing in Alaska, or my experience living in China and Taiwan for 15 years. And I was a teacher there and led tours and did all kinds of stuff. So if that stuff's beneficial for you or entertaining, subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.